There are two words my master spoke on a warm evening in the June of that year, spoken idly, without heat or intent, and I have come to believe that no cannonade, no ruin at law, no death by fever ever emptied a great house so thoroughly as those two small words emptied Charnwood. I was there when he said them. I was there, likewise, the following morning, when he stood in the middle of a room that'd been made ready for a bride and understood, slowly and with particular horror of a man to whom nothing has ever been refused, that the bride had gone. And it is because I was there for both, and because I loved him even in his blindness, that I set the whole of it down now. He would call it a small matter. He called most things small that touched the heart, which was precisely his difficulty. I have lived long enough to know that the smallest matters are commonly the ones that unmake us. Let me first do my master the justice he could never quite do himself, for he was not a bad man, and I will not have him remembered as one. Henry, Duke of Charnwood, was in his 35th year at the time of which I write, and there was scarcely a duty of his great station that he did not discharge with a scrupulous and unwearying exactness. His tenants were housed and their roofs kept sound. His accounts, which passed through my hands, were honest to the farthing. His charities were given without display and his obligations met before they were asked. He rose early, he read gravely, he spoke little and never in anger, and he had about him that deep reserve which lesser men mistake for pride, and which was in truth a kind of shyness grown armoured with the years. I had served him 7 years by then as his private secretary, and had come to esteem him past any master I had known or hoped to know. He was just, he was constant, he was, in 100 visible things, admirable, and he was, in one thing only, as blind as a stone. It was not cruelty in him. I must be plain upon this, for the whole of my tale hangs upon the distinction. A cruel man sees the heart he wounds and wounds it for the pleasure of the wound. My master did not see it at all. He moved among the feelings of others as a tall man moves through a low room, forever striking his head against beams he has not troubled to notice, and being astonished each time at the blow. He had governed himself so long, and felt so little permitted to himself, that he had, I think, half forgotten that others were not so governed, that under the plain surface of a quiet woman there might run depths he had never sounded, because it had never occurred to him to lower a line. He managed men. He managed money and land and the long, slow business of an ancient name, of the interior country of another living soul he knew at 35, almost nothing, and did not know that he did not know it, which is the most dangerous ignorance there is. It was in this temper that he approached the matter of his marriage. He approached it, I may as well say at once, exactly as he approached the draining of the low meadows or the re-roofing of the almshouse, as a thing needful, long deferred, and best got through sensibly and without fuss. The dukedom wanted an heir. The matchmaking mammoth of 3 counties had grown insupportable. His aunts wrote him letters of a length and persistence that would have worn down granite. He resolved, that spring, to end the whole tiresome business by marrying, and he set about choosing a wife with the same calm, incurious efficiency he would have brought to choosing a bailiff. He desired a lady of decent birth and no scandal, of quiet manners and no expensive wants, who would order his houses, do the honours of his table, and trouble him with no more feeling than the occasion strictly required. He did not desire, and here I quote him near enough to his own words, to be made a fool of by his own blood at his time of life. Romance he held to be a folly of boys and poets. What he wanted was a suitable woman who would be convenient to have, and who would let him alone. Such a woman was found for him, or rather was proposed to him, by Lady Osmond. I never much cared for Lady Osmond, and I shall try to be fair to her notwithstanding, which is harder. She was a distant connection of my master's, a widow of large acquaintance and small fortune, who lived by the management of other people and called it kindness. She had in her house, and had had these 6 years, a poor relation of her own, a cousin's daughter, orphaned and undowered, kept partly from duty and partly because an unpaid gentlewoman is a great convenience in a household that cannot afford a paid one. This was Miss Jane Verrall. And it was Lady Osmond who, perceiving the Duke's mind and perceiving her own advantage in it, brought the two together, praised the one to the other with just that air of careless disinterest that is the whole art of the matchmaker, and had the arrangement half made before either principal had well understood that an arrangement was toward. I must tell you of Miss Verrall, for she is the heart of this, and because I flatter myself that I saw her, that whole spring, more truly than any other person under that roof, my master least of all. She was, I suppose, 7 or 28, the daughter of a country clergyman lately dead, a man of learning and no money, who had bred her upon books and left her upon the world with nothing but the book's contents in her head and not a shilling in her hand. She was not a beauty, if by beauty you mean the sort that stops a room. She was of middle height and quiet colouring, and she had learned, as such women learn, to make herself unnoticeable, to sit a little back from the candle, to speak when spoken to and not before. A stranger would have passed her 100 times and carried away no impression whatever. Lady Osmond, who had lived beside her 6 years, plainly carried away none. She spoke of Jane when she spoke of her at all, as one speaks of a serviceable piece of furniture, useful, unobtrusive, and there. But I watched her, over the weeks of that betrothal, and I will tell you what a watching eye could see. I saw that when the talk at dinner turned dull or false, it was Jane's face and no other that held the flicker of a private amusement, gone the instant it was seen. That she had a wit she had been schooled by long dependence to keep sheathed, and that it was quicker and kinder than any wit worn openly in that company. I saw her be gentle with a frightened housemaid on the back stairs when she believed herself unobserved, and gentle in a way that cost her something and asked nothing back. I saw her read as other people breathe, and once, coming upon her alone in the library with a volume of poems, I saw her look up at me with her whole face unguarded for a moment, alight with something, before the shutter came down and she was the quiet dependent cousin again, apologizing for the intrusion of her presence in a room. She had, in short, a depth, a worth, an entire hidden landscape of herself, that not one soul in that house had ever troubled to walk into, and a lifetime of being passed over, overlooked, reckoned of no account, had worked in her this single, secret, terrible tenderness that of all the words in the language, the one she could not have borne to hear was that she was unremarkable. She had been treated as unremarkable her whole life long. She had borne it. But to hear it named aloud, and by the one to whom she was now to give herself that, I came afterward to understand, was the one blow her patience was not proof against. There was one thing more, and it matters, so I set it here. A little before the wedding was fixed, there had come to Jane, from an old godmother lately dead, a woman who had known her mother and had not, it seems, forgotten her, a small independent legacy. It was no fortune. It would not have kept a carriage or bought a name. But it was hers, absolutely hers, the first thing in the whole of her life that was, and it was enough, just enough for a sensible woman to live upon, plainly and free, if she chose. I do not think Lady Osmond ever properly attended to it. I do not think my master knew of it at all. But I knew of it, for such papers passed my desk, and I remember thinking, without at all knowing why the thought disquieted me, here is a woman who, for the first time in her life, need not stay where she is not wanted. It is a strange and a fearful thing, to a household that has always been able to count upon a person's having nowhere else to go, suddenly and unregarded that person acquires somewhere. So the thing was made, the settlements were drawn, I drew half of them myself. The date was set for a morning in the last week of June, and on the evening before, there was a small gathering at Charnwood, no great ball. My master had no taste for that, but a dinner of some 30 persons, the nearer connections and 2 or 3 of the county, to mark the eve of the wedding. It was a mild, still evening. The long windows of the great drawing-room stood open upon the terrace, and the whole company was easy and pleased with itself in the way of people who have dined well and expect a wedding in the morning. I was present, in my useful corner, as I generally was. It was late in the evening, and the company had broken into knots, when old Sir Marcus Enderby, a bluff, kind, tactless man, a neighbour of 40 years, drew my master a little aside toward the open window, with a glass in his hand and that jovial confidingness that wine and long acquaintance breed. I was near enough, being about some small errand of my master's, to hear the whole of it, though neither marked me. Sir Marcus was in a mood to be sentimental over the marriage, as old men are, and he clapped my master upon the shoulder and asked him, in the round carrying, unlowered voice of the comfortably deaf, how he did, and whether he was not a happy man tonight, and what he thought of his bride, and whether this was not, after all, a love match got up in duty's clothing, hey? And my master weary, I think, of the sentiment, and being asked directly, and having a horror of any pretence to feelings he did not possess, so that in a way it was his very honesty that undid him. My master answered him plainly. He said that he thanked him, that he was well enough, that Miss Verrall was a sensible woman who would suit him without giving trouble, which was all he asked of the estate of marriage. And then with the mild, dismissing half-smile of a man closing a subject that bored him, he said the two words. He said that the match was a convenient one, if unremarkable, and that he had had quite enough of remarkable people to last him his life, and looked for nothing better than to be let alone in peace. He meant no unkindness by it. I would swear to that on any book you like. He meant, in his own blind fashion, almost a compliment that here at last was no drama, no scene, no fortune-hunting, no display. Here was quiet and sense and peace. He said it as another man might say that a house was commodious or a horse sound. He said it and turned his glass in his fingers and was thinking, I dare say, of nothing at all. Sir Marcus laughed his comfortable laugh, and the two words went out upon the still air of that mild June evening and were gone, as my master supposed, into nothing. They were not gone into nothing. For a little back from the window, in the shadow of the long curtain, where she had come with some message from Lady Osmond and had stopped, unnoticed, as she stopped everywhere unnoticed, stood Miss Jane Verrall, and she had heard. I saw her. That is the thing I have carried these many years, and will carry to the end, that of all that company I alone saw her hear it. She did not cry out. She did not so much as change her posture. There was no scene. There was never, from first to last, any scene in her, and it is that which I have found I cannot forget. There passed across her face only for the space of a breath, and then not even that, a stillness so complete that it was more terrible than any weeping. It was the look of a person who has just heard, spoken aloud and carelessly, and by the one voice in the world it should not have come from, the exact verdict that her whole life had been passing upon her in silence, the confirmation from the very quarter to which she had come to give herself, that she was and would always be precisely what everyone had always found her, a convenience if that, and unremarkable. I saw her take it. I saw her, I can find no other words, receive her sentence. And then she gathered herself, quietly, as she did all things quietly, and she delivered Lady Osmond's message to whomsoever it was for, and she went out of the room without a sound, and no one but I had marked that she had been in it at all. Which was, of course, the whole of the matter, entire and complete, though I did not yet know that it was. I have gone over that half-minute more times than I can number, and asked myself what I ought to have done, and never found an answer that satisfies me. I might have gone after her. I did not. It was not my place, and I did not, in that moment, understand what I had witnessed. I understood only that something had happened, and that it was grievous, and that it was not mine to touch. The evening closed. The guests went up or drove home. My master, well pleased that a tedious duty was so nearly discharged, bade me good night with more warmth than common and went to his rest an easy man. I did not sleep well. I could not have told you why. The morning of his wedding day broke as fair as the evening had been. I was at my desk early, and the house was early astir, with that particular fluttering, purposeful bustle a house wears on the morning of a great event, the servants half solemn and half gay, flowers coming in at the side door, the chapel being swept. And into the middle of this, a little after 8, came the first thread of the unravelling. A maid could not find Miss Verrall. Her cousin had sent to her room and had no answer. Her room being at length opened, was empty, the bed not slept in, and upon the writing table a single folded paper. I will not set down here the hour that followed, the running feet and the raised voices and Lady Osmond's shrill mounting disbelief. It belongs to another part of the tale. What I will set down is the note, for I saw it, my master having, in his stupefaction, thrust it wordlessly into my hand as if I could make it read otherwise. It was very short. It thanked his grace for the honour he had done her. It begged, with a composure that was itself a kind of dignity, to be released from an engagement she found, on reflection, that she could not fulfil. It wished him sincerely every happiness. It was signed in a small, even, unhurried hand that had not once faltered upon the page. Jane Verrall, not, you will observe, as she had every right for one more day to sign herself in any borrowed grandeur, but only and finally with her own plain name. There was no reproach in it. There was not one word of the two words. That, I think, was the most dignified thing of all and the most complete, for she left him nothing to answer, nothing to argue, nothing to mend, only the fact, quiet as herself, that she was gone. And so I come to the picture with which I began, and which is graven upon me, my master standing in the long drawing-room where he had spoken the night before, in the full light of his wedding morning, with the note in my hand and the flowers arriving at the door, and the whole ordered machinery of his convenient marriage running smoothly forward into empty air. He did not rage. He was not, then or ever, a man who raged. He stood very still, as she had stood, and upon his face was a thing I had never in 7 years seen there. He was confounded. He, who had never in his life been refused anything, who had chosen a wife as he chose a bailiff and had thought the whole matter as good as settled, stood in that pleasant sunlit room and could not, though I watched him try, make it come right in his understanding. That the convenient woman should have been inconvenient, that the unremarkable woman should have done, without scene or warning or the smallest breach of dignity, the single most remarkable thing that had happened at Charnwood in 20 years. That she had simply and quite finally declined to be either the one or the other. He turned to me at last, and he asked me, and I have never forgotten the blank, boyish bewilderment of it in that grave and governed man. He asked me why, as though I could tell him. As though he had not, with his own mouth and his own too careless words, told the whole of it himself the evening before, within 3 yards of where she stood. He did not yet know that he had spoken them. He did not yet know she had heard. He knew only that the room was empty, and that he could not understand it. And it is there, with my master standing jilted and stunned in the wreck of his own convenience, wholly unable to conceive that a heart he had never troubled to see had at last got up and walked out of his house, that this history truly begins. The house did not fall silent at once. On the contrary, it grew for some hours very loud. A great event long prepared cannot be halted in an instant, and there is a dreadful comedy, which I have never been able to think upon without a wince, in the way the ordered machinery of a wedding ran on for a full half-day after the wedding itself had ceased to exist. The flowers continued to arrive. The cook, not yet told, sent up word to know at what hour the breakfast should be served. A carriage came round to the sweep at the appointed time and stood there, the horses stamping, until someone thought to send it away. And through the middle of all this bustling, purposeful ignorance moved the small hard fact of the empty room, spreading outward from it like cold water through cloth, reaching one servant and then another, so that the gaiety of the morning curdled by degrees into a hushed, avid, appalled excitement that was in its way far worse. Lady Osmond was the storm's centre, and she filled that office to the utmost of her considerable powers. I had thought her, before that day, merely a cold and calculating woman. I learned that morning that she could be a loud one. Her first emotion, and I believe her sincerest, was not concern for her cousin, but a towering, incredulous fury at the injury to herself. She had made this match. It was the great achievement of her managing life. She had as good as bought the connection, and had already, I do not doubt, spent its consequence 100 times over in her imagination. To have it snatched away, and snatched away not by death or misfortune, which are respectable, but by the wilful act of the very creature she had housed and fed and condescended to for 6 years, was an outrage that seemed fairly to unseat her reason. She swept through the house demanding of the walls how Jane could have done it, how the ungrateful girl dared, what was to become of them all now. She wept, but they were the tears of affront and not of loss, and more than once, forgetting who might hear her, she let fall the true shape of her grievance, which was that after all she had done, this was her thanks. That a young woman might have feelings of her own capable of governing her conduct seemed never once to cross her cousin's mind. To Lady Osmond, Jane had no more business having a will than a chair has, and the exercise of one was a sort of insurrection in the furniture. The scandal was not slow. These things never are, and this one had every quality to speed it. A Duke of Charnwood, one of the first men in the kingdom, with a name that went back past the Conquest, jilted, upon the very morning of his wedding, and jilted by a nobody, an undowered clergyman's orphan, a poor relation kept on sufferance, a woman without fortune, beauty, or consequence of any kind. The thing was too good. It was too perfectly against all the order of the world. Within the week it was in 3 counties, and within the fortnight, I make no doubt, in every drawing-room in town, growing as it went, as such tales grow. Until in some tellings she had run off with a music master, and in others carried away the Charnwood diamonds, when the plain truth was that she had carried away nothing at all but herself and a small legacy that was her own. I minded it for my master's sake. He, characteristically, appeared not to mind it in the least, or affected not to. He went about his business with a face of stone and gave the gossips the one thing that most confounds them, which is a gentleman who declines entirely to perform his own humiliation for their benefit. But I saw the set of his jaw when a letter came from one of his aunts, all sympathy on its face and all avid curiosity beneath, and I knew that he felt the world's eye upon him, and hated it, and did not in the smallest degree understand what it was truly looking at. For here I must be honest concerning my master, as I set out to be, and the honesty does him no credit, though I love him and will tell it plainly. In those first days he did not grieve. Let no one suppose that he sat stricken with the loss of a beloved woman, for he did no such thing, and to pretend it would be to spoil the whole truth of what came after. What he felt, purely and simply, was affront and bafflement. He had been refused, he who had never in the length of his life been refused anything, had held out his hand and had it declined, and the sensation was so entirely novel to him that he could make nothing of it whatever. He turned it over as a man turns over a coin in a currency he does not know. And beneath the affront lay the deeper thing, which was sheer incomprehension, that the arrangement had been so sensible, so convenient, so plainly to the advantage of a portionless woman who could not in reason have looked one half so high, and that she had thrown it over. It offended his understanding before ever it touched his heart. He said to me, more than once in those first days, some version of the same bewildered thing, that he could not conceive what she had wanted, that he had offered her everything, that no sensible woman could have acted so, that there must be some cause he was not in possession of. And never once, in all his turning of it, did he come within a mile of the two small words he had spoken by the open window, for he had, in the most literal truth, forgotten that he had spoken them at all. They had cost him nothing to say. How should he remember them? He hunted everywhere for his answer except in the one place it lay, which is the commonest form of blindness there is, and was the whole of his. And because he could not find it, and because I could, for I had seen her hear it, I must now do what he could not, and set down who it was that he had lost, that the size of his loss may be understood even while he could not yet begin to measure it. I have told already something of Jane Verrall, the clergyman's daughter, bred on books and left penniless, passed at her father's death from one grudging household to another. But I did not tell, because it belongs here, the whole slow grinding shape of that life, which no single fact conveys, but only the sum of them piled year on year. Consider what it is to be a poor relation, and to be one from girlhood. It is to be forever in a house and never of it. It is to be useful, oh, endlessly useful, for that is the price of the roof. To sit with the sick and the tedious, to write the notes no one else will trouble to write, to give up your fire and your candle and your place by the window the instant a paying guest requires it. To be sent for and sent away, to have your time reckoned no time, because it is no one's but your own. It is to hear yourself spoken of across your own head, as Lady Osmond spoke of her, as though you were a serviceable object and not a listening soul. It is to learn, because you must, to want nothing visibly, to have no preferences that might inconvenience, to make yourself small and quiet and easily overlooked, because to be noticed is generally to be found in the way. Jane had learned all of this so thoroughly that it had become her second nature, and a stranger, seeing only the still, retiring, unassuming woman, would have supposed there was nothing beneath the stillness to assume, but there was everything beneath it. That was the cruelty of her case, and no one saw it. All that quickness, that hidden wit, that deep and unspent tenderness I have described, all of it was there, folded down small and kept out of sight, not because she lacked it, but because a lifetime had taught her that no one wished to see it. That it was surplus to her function, that she was valued precisely and only for the absence of anything remarkable about her. She had been unremarkable to everyone she had ever lived among, not because she was so, but because not one of them had ever once troubled to look. And into this life, so schooled to expect nothing, had come the great arrangement of her marriage, in which market she was the person least consulted of anyone concerned. Lady Osmond had made it. The Duke had assented to it. The lawyers, of whom I was one, had drawn it. Jane had been informed of it. I do not think from first to last that any living creature had sat down with her and asked her, plainly and as though her answer signified, whether she wished to give herself for life to this grave and silent stranger. It had been settled over her head, as everything in her life had been settled over her head, and she had bowed to it as she had bowed to everything, because a portionless woman does not refuse a duke, and because she had, so far as anyone had ever shown her, nowhere else on the earth to go. She would have gone through with it, I am persuaded, and been a good and faithful wife, and given him no trouble exactly as he desired. She would have folded herself down smaller than ever and lived out her life unregarded in a palace instead of a lodging, and called it her portion and borne it. She had made herself ready to bear it, and she might have borne anything at all but the one thing she was given to hear at the last, for here was the terrible fitness of it, that a crueller man could not have contrived by design. Of all the words in the language, the single word that could pierce clean through the armor of that patient, overlooked, self-effacing woman was the word unremarkable, and it was that word, that precise word, and not another, that she heard fall from the lips of the man she was within a day of marrying. It was not a new sentence to her, it was the oldest sentence in her world. It was the verdict her whole life had passed upon her in 100 silent ways, but she had never before heard it spoken aloud in so many words, by the very person to whom she was about to entrust the whole remainder of her days, the one for whom, perhaps, some starved and secret corner of her had allowed itself to hope for something else, some seeing, some being at last known. And instead she heard, carelessly, over a glass of wine, within 3 yards of where she stood, that she was convenient if unremarkable, and he asked nothing better than to be let alone. I have thought since she must have felt in that moment as though a door she had scarcely dared to know she was standing before had been shut in her face without the man behind it so much as noticing she was there. It was the last confirmation. It was the whole of her life said over in 2 words by the one voice that might have unsaid it. And this is the hinge on which everything now turned, and I bless the dead godmother for it to this day. For the first time in the whole of that life, Jane Verrall had the means to answer. I have told of the small legacy come to her from her mother's old friend, lately dead, no fortune, but enough, just enough, for a sensible and frugal woman to live upon plainly and free. Set that little sum against the whole preceding history and you see it at once for what it was. It was not money. It was the first freedom she had ever possessed. It was somewhere to go. All her life she had stayed where she was not wanted because she had no choice but to stay. The household had counted always upon her having nowhere else, and now, quietly, unregarded, she had somewhere else, and no one had thought to reckon with it. So that when the blow fell, she was, for the first and only time, in a position to decline it. She need not marry to be housed. She need not be a convenience to keep a roof above her. She could, for once in her life, consult nothing but her own soul, and her own soul, so long silent, said at last, and with a quiet finality there was no gainsaying, no, not this. Not to be told, and to spend a lifetime being told, that I am nothing worth looking at, by the very man I would have given all my looking to. And she took up her pen in that small even hand that did not falter, and she wrote her 6 composed and dignified lines. And she gathered the little that was truly hers, and before the house was awake she was gone, not in tears, not in a passion, not with any scene, for there was never any scene in her, but simply and finally, walking out of a life that had never value toward one, please God, that might. Now let me return to my master, and trace what the days did to him, for it was not nothing, and it was the beginning of all that mattered. I have said that in the first shock he felt only affront and bafflement, and this is true, but a house from which someone has quietly gone is a subtle instrument, and it began, slowly, to work upon him in ways he neither invited nor understood. The wedding was undone, the guests dispersed, the scandal left to burn itself out. The great business of the estate rolled forward, and he gave himself to it as ever. And yet, there was of an evening an empty place. There was a chair in the small library where she had used to sit a little back from the candle with her book, and he had never once, that I knew of, remarked her sitting there while she sat. But now that the chair was empty, he remarked the emptiness, which is a strange backward way for a man to first perceive a presence, and it troubled him, and he did not know why it troubled him. He grew restless of an evening in a manner quite unlike his settled habit. He took to walking the length of the long gallery after dinner, and there was the note. He had it still. He had never given it back to me nor let it be destroyed, and I came to know for a secretary sees much that is not meant for him that he took it out and read it over when he supposed himself unobserved. That short, cool, civil note that told him nothing and reproached him with nothing and left him, as I had said from the first, nothing whatever to answer. I think it was the note that began to turn the key in him. A man may dismiss a scene. There had been no scene. A man may argue with a reproach. There was no reproach. There was only this composed and final courtesy, this closing of a door so gently that the very gentleness of it would not let him rest, and behind it the growing, unwelcome, formless sense that he had lost something, not something owed to him, not something snatched from his consequence, but something in itself, something he had held within his very house for a whole spring and never once put out his hand to know. He would not have named it so. He named it, when at length he named it at all, in the language of duty and repair, which was the only language in which he had ever permitted himself to feel. It was a scandal, he said, and must be mended. It was not fitting that a gentlewoman connected with his family should be adrift in the world under such a cloud. He told himself and told me, an obligation to see that she came to no harm, to do right by her, to set straight what had gone crooked. All of which was true, and all of which was, I saw plainly even then, a decent cloak flung over something he had no words for and would have been alarmed to look at bare. For I watched him say these dutiful things, and I watched his face while he said them, and the face did not match the words. The words were a magistrate's. The face was that of a man who has woken in the night to a silence in the house and cannot go back to sleep for the strangeness of it. He did not miss a convenience. One does not read a convenience's note by candle when one supposes oneself alone. He missed her, though he would sooner have died than say so, and could not for his life have told you it was so, for he did not know it. He knew only that the quiet, unremarkable woman he had thought would trouble him, with no feeling whatever, had gone out of his house and left behind her a silence he found, to his own deep confusion, that he could not live in. And so it came by the end of that fortnight to the thing that set the rest in motion. He sent for me one grey evening into the small library, her library, though neither of us said it, and he stood a long while at the darkening window with his back to me and the note. I do not doubt, somewhere about him, and when he turned his face was composed and his voice was even, and only I, who knew him, could have told that beneath the composure something had shifted and would not shift back. He said that this business could not be let to lie. He said that Miss Verrall must be found, that he would know where she was gone and that she was safe and provided for, that he could not, in conscience, leave the matter as it stood. He gave me a dozen sound and dutiful reasons, and I wrote them all down and believed not the half of them, and neither, I think, at the very bottom of him, did he. He did not understand himself. He did not yet know it would be long and cost him much before he knew that what drove him was not conscience and not the scandal and not the mending of appearances, but the first faint intolerable stirring of a heart he had never used, reaching out after a woman he had never troubled to see until the space where she had been began, at last, to ache. He knew only that she must be found, and he charged me to find her, and God help us both, I began. The finding of a person who does not wish to be found is a slower and a stranger business than the tellers of tales allow, and it is slower yet when the seeker is a Duke of Charnwood and cannot for his life be seen to seek. That was the first great difficulty, and it hampered us at every turn from the outset. A common man may go about openly asking after a woman. He may put a line in the newspapers, employ a runner, knock upon doors, and make no secret of his errand. My master could do none of these things. To be known to be hunting the very woman who had jilted him upon his wedding morning would have been to spread a second scandal fresh upon the ashes of the first, and to furnish every drawing-room in 3 counties with precisely the spectacle he most abhorred. The great Duke refused. Gone trailing across the kingdom after the nobody who would not have him. His pride, which was considerable and was moreover the only garment he had to cover a wound he would not so much as name, forbade it absolutely. And so the search had to be conducted sidelong in whispers, through 3rd and 4th hands, with a discretion so scrupulous that it tied our own hands nearly as fast as it hid his. and I, being his instrument in all things, was the one sent creeping down these byways with my hat in my hand, and a fiction always ready on my tongue. For every inquiry had to be dressed as something other than it was. I could not ask after Miss Verrall. I asked, rather, on behalf of a firm of solicitors, concerning a small matter of a legacy that must be regularized, which had at least the merit of being near enough the truth to survive a second question. I wrote letters that said less than they seemed to say. I called upon persons who had known her and led the talk, by long circuits, round to her name, and watched their faces and came away with little. And the false trails were many, for a woman who has vanished draws rumour as carrion draws crows. She had gone to a cousin in Yorkshire. She had taken ship for the Indies. She had been seen at Harrogate, at Cheltenham, at Lyme. I ran down 3 of these myself, at no small cost of coach fare and boot leather, and each dissolved in my hands into nothing, or into some other quiet woman in grey who was not she. The Cheltenham report I own I half believed, for it was circumstantial, and I gave the better part of a week to it, only to find at the end of my chase a widowed governess of much the same colouring, who had never heard the name of Verrall in her life. And I came back to Charnwood that time wearier and emptier than usual, and found my master waiting up for me in the small library at an hour past midnight. Upon a pretence of business, to hear that I had failed again, he did not reproach me. He said only after a silence that he supposed she did not wish to be found, and turned his face to the fire, and there was in the plain flat words a desolation he did not know he had let me hear. It would be a month and more before any of it came to anything, and through the whole of that month he asked me, at the close of each day, and with a studied carelessness that deceived neither of us, whether there was news, and I said, most evenings, that there was none. And I watched the thing work in him, for it did work in him, and here I come to what I did not look for and could not have foreseen, that the search, barren as it long was of its object, was not barren of effect, but was all the while doing to my master a work more lasting than any finding. He had set out to recover a fact a person mislaid, a scandal to be tidied, an obligation to be squared. What he found, in the seeking, was that he had never known the first thing about her, and he could not seek her without, every step, being told. For to trace a person you must ask what she was like, whither such a one would go, what she loved and feared and wanted, and every such question, put to me or put through me to others, came back with an answer that took him unawares. He learned, from an old servant of Lady Osmond's whom I found and gently pumped, that Miss Verrall had for years risen before the house to have an hour with her books uninterrupted, and had taught the still room maid her letters of an evening, asking nothing and telling no one. He learned that she had nursed a sick child of the gatekeeper's through a fever the winter past, sitting up 3 nights, while the family she lived among supposed her merely gone early to bed. He learned, in short and reluctantly, and in fragments that he could not fit together and could not put down, that there had lived under his own roof that spring a woman of a particular and unshowy goodness, that the whole household had leaned upon, and no member of it had ever once acknowledged. And I saw him receive each fragment with a small deepening frown, as a man might who begins to suspect he has been robbed of something and cannot yet reckon what. It was through the legacy that we found her in the end, as I had always thought we should, for money leaves a track that sentiment does not. The old godmother's small bequest had been settled through an attorney in Bath, a dry and cautious man not easily drawn, but a legacy must be paid somewhere, to some direction, and after much patient courtesy and one small, and I fear not wholly candid representation of my business, I came away with the one thing needful, which was the name of a town. She had gone to Wells. She had taken, some 6 weeks since, a lease upon a narrow house of grey stone in a quiet street hard under the shadow of the great west front of the cathedral, and had settled there, and was living there still, plainly and openly under her own name, having, you will observe, never for an instant hidden at all. That was the thing that struck me as I read it, and struck my master harder when I laid it before him. She had not fled and cowered, she had not gone to earth. She had simply removed herself, once and finally, from a place where she was not valued, and set up her rest in the light of day in a place of her own choosing, and asked nothing of anyone, and left it to the world to find her or not as it pleased. There is a kind of courage that makes no noise whatever, and I was beginning that summer to learn its face. And now I must tell what we came to know of the life she had made there, some of it gathered before ever my master went down in the slow way of inquiry, and much of it learned by me afterward from her own lips and from the lips of those who had come, in a few short weeks, to love her. For it is the very hinge and marrow of this history, and without it the meeting that followed cannot be understood. Wells is a small, grave, gracious city, more like a large and ancient village gathered about its cathedral than a town, and it keeps society of its own, the families of the clergy, a physician or two, some half-dozen households of quiet gentility, close-knit, mannerly, and quick to know a newcomer. Into this society Miss Jane Verrall, undowered spinster of no connection that she chose to advertise, had come without introduction or éclat, and within 6 weeks, by the sole force of what she was, she had become the thing she had never in her life been suffered to be. She had become somebody. She had become, indeed, and I set the words down deliberately, the quietly admired centre of that little world. I could scarcely credit it as the accounts came in, and then I could credit nothing else, for they all agreed. There was old Canon Farrant, a scholar of 80, gone nearly blind, who had used to sit out his days in a darkened melancholy. Miss Verrall read to him 3 afternoons in the week, Greek and history and the poets, and read so well, and talks shrewdly of what she read, that the old man declared to all who would hear him that she had given him back his eyes and half his youth, and that he had not been so well companioned since his wife died. There was Mrs. Pelham, the precentor's widow, a formidable and lonely woman whom the town went in some awe of, who had taken to Miss Verrall as she had taken to no creature in years, and consulted her upon everything, and said openly and often that Jane Verrall had more sense in her quiet head than the whole close put together. There was the physician, Dr. Renton, a grave and kindly widower of middle age, much respected thereabouts, who found in her conversation, he was not shy to say, a quickness and a depth that he had met in no other woman of his acquaintance, and who was to be seen more and more frequently of an evening at her small fireside. But of Dr. Renton I shall have more to say hereafter, and will let it lie for now. And there were the children she taught their letters for the love of it, and the poor she visited without fuss, and the dozen small households that had learned already to send round to the grey house in trouble or in doubt, because Miss Verrall would know what was best to be done, and would do it, and would never afterward speak of it. She kept her modest table. She gave her small particular dinners at which the talk, they told me, was better than anywhere in Wells, for she drew people out and set them at their ease, and had a way of making each guest feel himself, for that evening, the most interesting person in the room. The wit she had hidden all her life she now spent freely, and it was found delightful. The tenderness she had folded away was now poured out, and it was found precious. The deep good sense that Lady Osmond had used for 6 years and never once thanked was now sought on every hand and prized above rubies. She had not changed, you understand. She had only at last been let into the daylight, and there in the daylight everyone could see what I had seen in the shadow of a curtain, that here was a rare and remarkable woman. Everyone could see it. It required no penetration at all. It required only that a person should trouble to look at her, which the world of Wells did as naturally as breathing, and which the one man who had held her within a day of being his own had never, in a whole spring, once done. Afterward, when I knew her, I asked her, greatly daring, whether she had been happy in those first weeks, and she considered the question with that composure of hers that never hurried and never faltered, and she said only that she had been, for the first time in her life, at home, that it was a strange thing, at 28, to learn that one was liked, not for one's usefulness, but for oneself, and that she had cried the first night a neighbour sent round a little dish of early plums with a kind word, not from sorrow, but from the sheer unaccustomedness of being thought of. I have not forgotten how she said it, without a particle of self-pity, as a traveller might describe a country he had reached late and did not mean to leave. It was into this life, then, and to this woman, that my master at last went down, and I went with him, and I saw the whole of it, and it is graven upon me scarcely less deep than that other picture which I began. He would take no ceremony and give no warning, that much of wisdom he had. We put up quietly at the Swan, and upon the second morning he walked, alone but for me a pace behind, to the grey house under the west front, and was admitted, and I with him, into a small, plain, bright parlour full of books, where a bowl of the very plums stood upon the table, and the window looked out upon the ancient stones, and there, rising from her chair with no more haste, and no less than she would have shown to any morning caller, stood Miss Jane Verrall to receive the Duke of Charnwood. I had wondered on the road down how she would meet him, with tears, with reproach, with the flutter of an old subjection, with triumph even. I might have spared myself. She met him with none of these. She met him with a calm and perfect civility, exactly measured, giving nothing and asking nothing, the civility of a woman entirely mistress of her own house and her own heart, who has a caller of rank to whom she owes courtesy and owes, precisely, no more. She was very composed. She was in her plain morning gown, in her own bright room, among the people and the books and the life that were her own, quietly and unanswerably formidable, and I saw my master check upon the threshold as a man checks who has come into a room expecting one thing and been met by another altogether. He was some while finding his voice, and when it came stiffly, in the language of the magistrate that was his only refuge. He had learned with concern, he said, of the manner of her removal, and had felt himself bound in honour to satisfy himself that she was safe and suitably placed and wanted for nothing. "As you see, your grace," she answered, with the faint composed smile of a hostess acknowledging a courtesy, and a small motion of her hand that took in the bright room, the books, the plums upon the table, the whole ordered sufficiency of her life. "I want for nothing at all," he said, more stiffly yet, that if there were any provision he might in conscience make, any way in which he could serve her, and there he stopped, for she had let a small silence fall, and into it she said, gently and without the least edge, that he was very good, but that she had lived some years now upon her own resources and found them, small as they were, entirely her own and entirely enough, that she asked nothing of anyone, and that she hoped his grace would not think her ungracious if she owned that there was nothing whatever she stood in need of. It was said so quietly and so finally, and with so complete an absence of either resentment or appeal, that it closed every door he had come prepared to open, and he sat there with his offices of repair dead in his hands, and not one of them of any use to her, for he had come, I do believe, still more than half persuaded that he would find the meek dependent of his memory the quiet, grateful woman who sat back from the candle, who would be flustered by his coming, who might, once the first awkwardness was past, be brought with a little condescension to see reason and be arranged. And there was no such woman in the room. There was instead a lady he did not know, self-possessed, unhurried, gently and immovably her own, who bade him be seated in her house as though the favour of the sitting were hers to grant, which indeed it was, who inquired after his health and his journey in a voice of level pleasantness that had not one tremor in it, and who then waited, with her hands quiet in her lap and her clear eyes upon his face, for him to say what he had come so far to say, and gave him, in the waiting, not the smallest thread of encouragement to say it. I watched my master, who had faced parliaments and never lost his countenance, sit in that small bright parlour and lose it wholly. He was off his balance from the first moment, and never recovered it through the whole of that call. He had prepared, I make no doubt, some grave and dutiful speech of obligation and repair, and it withered on his tongue before the fact of her, for one cannot offer to rescue a woman who has plainly, and better than one ever managed for oneself, rescued herself. He looked at her. I saw him truly look at her, perhaps for the first hour in the whole of their acquaintance, look at the ease and the bloom and the quiet authority of her, at the remarkable and thoroughly visible woman sitting posed in the ruin of his every expectation, and I saw the thing break slowly over his grave face that I had waited the better part of 2 months to see, the full and thunderstruck understanding of what he had held and named Unremarkable, and let walk out of his house before ever he had troubled to lift his eyes to it. He had come to Wells to confer something upon her. He sat now in her parlour and understood, in a stricken silence he could not break with any of his prepared and useless words, that it was she who stood in possession of everything of her life, of her worth, of her own serene and unassailable dignity, and he who had come to the door with empty hands, a suitor before he knew he was one, to a woman who wanted nothing whatever that he had to give. We took our leave within the half hour, for she gave us no reason to linger. She rose and saw us to her door with the same even courtesy she had shown at our coming, and wished his grace a safe journey home, and stood a moment upon her own threshold under the great grey west front while we walked away, entirely at home in the life she had made, and entirely done, one could not doubt, with the life she had left. My master did not speak until we had gained the corner of the street. Then he said in a low voice, more to himself than to me, that he had not known her, that he had lived beside her a whole spring and had not known her at all. It was the truest thing I had ever heard him say, and the beginning of his wisdom, though it was to cost him dear before he was done. For the woman he had called Unremarkable stood now plainly revealed as the most remarkable he had ever met, and the pursuit he had thought half accomplished by the finding had, in that quiet bright parlour, only that morning truly begun. He did not go home. I had half expected that he would, and had ordered myself for the road, but when we came again to the Swan he stood a while in the low-panelled parlour we had taken, turning his hat in his hands as I had never in 4 years' service seen him do, and then he said, without looking at me, that he found he had business in the West that would keep him some days yet, and that I might unpack. It was the thinnest fiction he had ever offered me, and he knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us disturbed it, for the truth beneath it was too large and too new for him to handle. And it was this, that a man who has understood, all in one stricken half hour, exactly what he threw away, cannot rise the next morning and drive north, as though nothing had befallen him. He had come to Wells to discharge an obligation. He stayed in Wells, though he would not yet have owned it in those words, to court a woman, and he set himself to the courting with the whole grave force of his nature, and with, I must tell it plainly, almost none of the art. For here was the strangest spectacle of that strange summer, and I had a near seat to the whole of it. My master was a man who had never in his life sought anything, because everything had come to him arranged. He had not sought his title, nor his lands, nor his seat in the Lords, nor even, God help him, his bride. All had been settled upon him by birth, or by his men of business, or by the smooth machinery of consequence that surrounds a great house, and his part had been only to accept, gravely and dutifully, what was brought. He had reached 35 years without once having to earn the regard of another living soul, for the regard of the world is given to a Duke of Charnwood before he opens his mouth. And now he wanted a thing that no machinery could procure him and no rank could command the good opinion, and after it the heart of one quiet woman who had both, and had no need to give him either, and he came to the wanting of it as unpractised as a boy, and a great deal stiffer. He called upon her. That was the beginning of it, and it cost him more, I think, than the walk across the field to Waterloo would have cost a braver man than he. There is a form to be gone through in a place like Wells, and he went through it with a punctilio that would have been comic had it not been so plainly the arm of a man in terror of a rebuff. He sent round a civil note. He came at the correct hour. He stayed the correct 3/4 of an hour, and not a minute over. He spoke of the cathedral and the weather and the state of the roads. And Miss Verrill received him with that same even and unassailable courtesy she had shown at the first, gave him his tea, answered his remarks upon the cathedral with remarks upon the cathedral, and let him go again at the end of his 3/4 of an hour no nearer her than he had come. She did not refuse him the door. She would not have been so uncivil, nor, I came to think, so much afraid. A woman who bars her door confesses that the man upon the other side of it has power to trouble her, and Jane Verrill would confess no such thing. She did far worse. She admitted him freely, and gave him nothing, received him precisely as she received the Dean, or the apothecary come about a bill, with a level pleasantness that raised no wall he could storm and offered no chink he could enter, and that told him, more plainly than any closed door, that his coming and his going were events of no particular moment in the full and ordered day of her life. He came away from that first call grey in the face, and from the second no better, and I watched him address himself to the third with the dogged patience of a man laying a very long siege to a very quiet fortress. He contrived, in the days that followed, to be always where she was. He learned from me, for I made it my business to learn it, and his to be told the shape of her week, that she read to old Canon Farrant on the Tuesday and the Thursday and the Saturday, that she walked out early upon the green under the palace wall, that she was to be met within the cathedral itself of an evening when the light came slantwise through the great west window and there were few about, and he set himself in the way of these things. He fell in to step beside her upon the green of a morning, with a stiff word about the freshness of the hour. He was to be found of an evening, standing before some monument in the south aisle when she came through, so that mere decency obliged her to give him good evening and exchange a civil sentence before she passed on. He, who had all his life waited to be sought, now did the seeking humbly and awkwardly, and without the least notion how it was done, and I who loved him watched it with a full heart, for there is nothing so moving, and nothing so nearly ridiculous, as the sight of a proud man learning late and clumsily to sue, and it was genuine. I must set that down and set it down strongly, for the whole justice of what followed hangs upon it. Whatever had brought him to Wells' duty, the itch of a scandal unmended, the affront to his consequence of a bride who had refused him, whatever the tangle of motives that had set him on the road, the thing that kept him there and drove him out morning after morning to walk a cold green in hope of a quarter-hour's company was no longer any of these. He was in love. I do not think he had yet said the word to himself. He was not a man who found it easy to name what he felt, having had, all his shut and stately life, so little practice at the naming, but I saw it in him past all mistaking. I saw it in the way he attended when she spoke. As a man attends to a language he is only beginning to construe and cannot afford to lose a word of, in the way her rare and level smile would keep him in spirits half a day, and her graver silence cast him down. In 100 small unguarded slips of a countenance that had used to be shut as a strong box, he had begun by wishing to recover his own. He ended by wishing, simply and wholly and for the first time in his existence, to be found worthy by another creature. The trouble was that he had not the smallest idea how to make himself so, and that the very habits of a lifetime, the assumption, bred in the bone, that his regard was a thing that conferred and need not be earned, rose up at every turn to betray him. For while he was so occupied, the town of Wells looked on, and the town of Wells contained Dr. Renton. I have said I should have more to tell of him, and here I must tell it, for he stood at the very centre of what came. Dr. Renton was a physician of some 50 years, a widower these 10, grave, unhurried, and much beloved through all that country for a skill matched with a plain human kindness, a man of cultivation besides, who read his Latin poets for pleasure, and kept a good small library and a better conversation. He was in every way a man to respect, and I respected him, and do to this day, though he cost my master some of the blackest hours I ever watched him through. And the point of him, the whole hard point of him, was this, that Dr. Renton had seen Jane Verrall's worth from the very first, freely, and without the education of any loss. He had not needed to let her walk out of his house to learn what she was. He had met her, plainly and simply, as a rare and admirable woman, upon the 3rd evening of their acquaintance, and had valued her from that hour with a steady and unswerving regard. He asked nothing of her that she was not glad to give. He sat at her fireside 3 evenings in the week and talked of books and of the poor of the parish and of 100 quiet things. He did her 1,000 small unfussy services and made no parade of one of them, and he offered her, in the whole of his grave and gentle bearing, the one thing my master had never in a spring of daily nearness offered her, at all the tribute of a man who found her, exactly as she was and had always been, entirely enough. She was easy with him. That was the wound of it. And my master took the wound full, for he had eyes and the scene was not hidden from him. Where she was measured and armoured with the Duke, with Dr. Renton she was open, quick herself. She laughed with him and argued with him, and let him see the play of her mind without that grave guard she never once laid down before the greater man. And any looker-on, watching the two of them at her small fireside of an evening as my master watched them, once, from a chair set a little back, having contrived an invitation to a supper he must bitterly have wished undone, must have seen at a glance which of the two was at home in her regard, and which was the stranger at the gate. I saw my master see it. I saw him sit through that evening with his fine face composed to a stony civility and his heart, I make no doubt, breaking behind it, watching the woman he had come to want give freely to another man, and want nothing in return, the very ease and confidence he would have given his coronet to earn. And the cruelty of it, the exquisite justice of it, was that he could not even resent the doctor honestly. For Renton did him no wrong, cut him out by no art, spoke of him always with a courteous goodwill, and had simply, quietly, years and worlds ahead of him, done the one thing my master had left undone. He had looked at her in time. It was after that supper that the thing came to its head, and it came as such things will, through my master's pride, which had been schooled but was not yet broken, and which chose the worst of all possible moments to speak. He had walked her the little way home Renton, with a delicacy I could have struck him for, having yielded the office, and I was a few paces behind in the dark street under the great blind bulk of the cathedral, and I heard the most of it, and had the rest from her long after. He had meant, I am sure, to speak at last the thing he had come so far to speak, and he began, as he always began, from the wrong end of himself. He spoke of the past. He said stiffly, and with the gravity he used for his most difficult business, that the situation between them had been left by the events of the spring in a most irregular state, that he was sensible of the awkwardness it had occasioned to them both, and that he had come to Wells desirous of setting the matter, so far as it might now be set, upon a proper footing at last. She had stopped walking. I could not see her face in the dark, but I heard the change in her voice, the small cool settling of it, when she asked him quietly what footing he meant. He meant, he said, and I heard him reach, poor man, for the plain magistrate's language that was his only shelter, not knowing that he was cutting his own throat with every word. He meant that what had been so unhappily broken might yet, with good will upon both sides, be mended, that the engagement, so long as it stood unfulfilled, left a shadow upon them both which it was in their power to remove. That he was very willing here, I think he believed himself to be laying his whole heart before her, that he was entirely willing to renew his addresses, and to see the affair brought to the conclusion that had been first intended, and the whole unfortunate business thereby repaired. He said repaired to Jane Verrill in the dark under the cathedral, and I closed my eyes where I stood, for I knew, before ever she answered, that he had lost her. There was a silence, and when she spoke it was without heat, which was the worst of all, for heat she might have recovered from. She said that she thanked his grace for his condescension. She said that she was sensible of the honour he did her in wishing to repair so unfortunate a business. And then she said gently, evenly, with that composure that never faltered, and that I had come by now to know for the strongest thing in her, that she must beg leave to decline it. She had been, she said, once already a thing to be arranged, a match called convenient, and if his grace would recollect the word unremarkable, taken up because she was suitable and near to hand, and to be taken up again, it now appeared, because she was become inconvenient to leave lying. She would not be arranged a second time. She had made, since the spring, a life that was her own and that she valued. She wanted nothing repaired, for nothing in it was broken, and she wished, above all things, that his grace would understand that she was not a piece of his consequence gone astray and now to be recovered, nor a scandal walking about the world to be tidied out of his sight, but a living woman who had once been overlooked in his very house for a whole spring together, and who did not mean, having escaped it, to be overlooked and taken up by turns for the remainder of her days. He said, and I heard the pride in it rise to meet her, the old blind pride that could not, even then, even losing her, do the one plain thing, that she mistook him, that he had come a great distance and put aside no small consideration to make her this offer, and that he had not looked, he confessed, to have it met as though it were an affront. And there she had him, and she knew it, and she said only, very quietly, that she did not doubt he had come a great distance, nor that had cost him much, but that a man who tells a woman what his suit has cost him has told her without meaning it, precisely for whose sake he thinks the suit is made. She wished him, she said, a very good night, and she went in at her own door under the west front, and softly, and left him standing in the dark street with his repaired business dead in his hands and the whole of his unspoken heart still locked, unspoken behind his teeth. He never said it. That is the thing I carried away from that black evening and have not laid down since. He had it in him, I would stake my soul he had it in him, the plain and thunderstruck truth of what he felt, that he had been wrong, wholly and shamefully wrong, that he had lived beside her a whole spring and never troubled to lift his eyes to her, that she was the most remarkable creature he had ever known, and had walked in his own house unregarded, and that he loved her now, herself, and no fraction of her consequence. Past every consideration of repair, or of what the world might say. It was all there, dammed up behind the pride and the stiff magistrate's speech and the lifelong habit of a man who had never had to plead, and he could not get it past. He offered her, instead of his heart, the mending of a scandal. He offered her his consequence, when she had asked all her life and asked in vain, only to be seen, and she, who had learned at cruel cost to read a man's true meaning under his words, heard in his repairs and his considerations nothing but the wounded pride of a great man who could not bear to have been refused, and set her hand to her own door and closed it. We walked back to the Swan in a silence I did not dare to break. He did not speak of it that night, nor for 2 days after. He shut himself into the small parlour and would see no one, and I went softly about my business and grieved for him. And when at last he did speak, it was worse than his silence, for the pride had risen and hardened over the wound and become resolve, and he said to me, in a level cold voice that I had not heard since the morning she went away, that he had been a fool to come, that the lady had made her sentiments very plain, and he would not so far forget himself as to trouble her with them again, that we would return to Charnwood upon the Thursday. He said it as a man closes a book he does not mean to open, and Dr. Renton dined at the Grey House that same evening. I afterward learned, and sat late, and my master stood a long while at the dark window of the inn looking toward the great west front he could not see, and said nothing at all, and the distance between those two, which a single plain word might even then have closed, opened instead, that week in Wells, into a gulf that I did not, for a long while after, see how any word of his was ever to bridge. We did not go upon the Thursday. I have thought since that if he had held to that cold book-closing resolve, and driven north out of Wells while his pride was still equal to the doing of it, he might have carried away some tattered remnant of dignity, and spared himself and me the worst passage of that whole unhappy summer. But a man in his condition cannot go and cannot stay, and does by turns the one and the other. And upon the Wednesday evening, when I had the trunks half corded, he came into the low parlour where I worked and stood over the fire a great while, and then said, in a voice that strove for the level tone of business and did not altogether reach it, that he had reflected that it would have an ill appearance to quit the country so abruptly, as though he had been driven from it, that there were, besides, 1 or 2 matters touching the lady's settlement which a man of honour could not in conscience leave in the loose state they stood, and that we should remain some days yet, until these should be regularly concluded. It was the thinnest fiction he had offered me since the first, and I bowed to it, and uncorded the trunks, and grieved, for I understood, better than he did himself, what it was. It was not the settlement that kept him. It was that he could not bear to go while she was still in the world and within a half-mile of him, unwon, and being unable to say so, even to himself, he had dressed the raw need of his heart in the sober coat of a legal obligation, and called it duty, and believed himself. And out of that self-deception, as out of a poisoned spring, came the last and the worst of his blunders. For having persuaded himself that there was business to be done, he must needs go about the doing of it, and the shape the business took, when he had brooded upon it 2 days in that shut parlour, was the shape that a lifetime of command had worn into the very grain of him. He would not sue again. His pride would not stoop a second time to stand upon a cold green and beg a quarter-hour's notice from a woman who had twice let him go empty. But there was another way, an easier and a nobler seeming way, and it was the way of the great man who cannot win a thing and therefore resolves to bestow it. And I watched him take it, and could not stay him, and knew while he took it that he was driving the last nail with his own hand. He sent for his man of business out of Bath. I did not at the first understand the whole of what he purposed, for he was close upon it, and gave his instructions in the dry half-sentences he used for matters he did not choose to have looked at. But it came clear to me by degrees, and when it was clear I could have wept. He meant to settle upon her a fortune. Not to offer it he was past offering. Offering had been refused, but to convey it, to make it hers by deed whether she would or no, a great and irrevocable provision fixed upon Miss Jane Verrall for her life, unconditioned, unasked, and unanswerable. He would show her, he told me once, in a burst of the stiff pride that was the nearest his misery could come to speech, that his regard was not the mean and self-seeking thing she had taken it for, that he sought nothing of her, not her hand, not her thanks, not so much as her good opinion, that he could give royally and ask nothing again, and that when she saw the largeness of it she would be brought to understand at last the quality of the man she had refused. He believed, I do think, that he was performing an act of great generosity and great humility together. He believed he was laying his whole heart at her feet in the only language he had ever been taught to speak, and he could not see no more than a man born blind can see the color of the sky. Though you tell him of it all day that what he was in truth doing was to offer her money in the place of himself for the third time in their acquaintance, and to prove to her past all further doubt that he still, at the very bottom of him, did not know the difference, that he thought a woman's heart a thing that could be purchased or overwhelmed or shamed into surrender by the sheer weight of what a duke could lay down, that he had learned, in a whole spring of loving her, nothing whatever of what she was. I did what I could. It was little enough, and not my place, and I did it. I said to him upon some pretext of the drafting, that a lady so nice in her independence as Miss Verrall, might I put it as gently as I dared feel, such a provision rather as a weight laid upon her than as a freedom given, might read in it, being proud, a thing she could not answer and could not escape. He heard me out with his face shut, and then said only coldly that I did not understand these matters, that a gift asking nothing could offend no one of sense, and that when a thing was made unconditional it was thereby made incapable of insult. He was so sure. That was the pity of him, the whole grave pity of my master through the black of that week, that he was never surer of his footing than in the moment before he went over the edge, that the habit of a life in which his judgment had never once been gainsaid rose up to comfort him precisely when it was leading him to ruin. I bowed and drafted no more, and hoped only that the thing might be slow in the making. But while he was so occupied, the world beyond his shut window did not stand still to wait upon him, and the world beyond his window contained Dr. Renton, who had dined at the grey house under the west front upon the Thursday, and sat late, and had not been idle. I had the truth of that evening long afterward, and something of it nearer the time from the free talk of the town, which had already, in the way of towns, coupled the two names and looked on with a kindly interest to see the good doctor rewarded at last. He had not pressed her while the Duke's shadow lay across the green. There was a delicacy in Renton that would not so much as seem to take advantage of another man's ill fortune, and he had held his own counsel and bided his time and served her, as he had always served her, without a word said. But he was no fool, and he had eyes, and he had seen the Duke's grey face across her fire, and being a man who valued the woman above his own pride, and having waited, patiently and without display, through the whole slow spring of her settling at Wells, he judged that his hour was come, and he took it. He asked her, upon that Thursday evening, quietly and without ornament, to be his wife. I have wondered 1,000 times what she felt in that hour, and I do not think I shall ever wholly know it, for she was not a woman to spread her heart abroad, and what little I have of it is pieced from her own few words to me at the last, and from what a watching servant could gather. But I believe it firmly that she was very near to saying yes. Consider only how it stood with her. Here was a man of worth and gentleness, esteemed of the whole country, of a mind that answered her own. A man who had looked at her plainly upon the third evening of their acquaintance and found her, exactly as she was, entirely enough, who had never once in all their friendship thought her convenient, or unremarkable, or a thing to be arranged, but had loved the very qualities the Duke had walked past unseeing: her wit, her quiet, her level courage, the mind she showed him without a guard. He asked her nothing she could not gladly give. He offered her no consequence and no repairs, but only a good man's steady seeing regard and a fireside, and the certainty of being valued to the end of her days for herself and no fraction of herself. And he offered it out of no loss, having never needed to lose her to learn her worth. And against all this, upon the other side of the scale, there stood what? A great man who had overlooked her for a whole spring in his own house, who had named her convenient and unremarkable in the hearing of servants, who had come after her only when she was gone, and courted her stiffly, and offered her at the last the mending of a scandal in the place of his heart, and who, for aught she knew as she sat by her fire that Thursday night, had by now shaken the dust of Wells from his wheels and gone north to forget her among his acres. A woman weary of being undervalued, and self-protecting and wise, might well have looked from the one to the other and chosen the safe and the true and the tried. I do not blame her that she leaned toward it. I marvel rather that she did not close her hand upon it that very night. She asked him for a little time, that much I know. She did not refuse him, she valued him too truly to refuse so gaman in haste, but asked him gently for a few days in which to be certain of her own mind, and he, who understood her as the Duke had never troubled to do, granted it without a shadow of complaint, and kissed her hand, and went home to wait as patiently as he had waited through all the spring, and so the matter hung, through the Friday and the Saturday, upon a hair. And the Duke sat in his parlour drafting deeds that were to overwhelm her with his generosity, and did not know that the woman he meant to astonish was within 3 days, and perhaps within 3 words, of promising herself to another man. It was upon the Sunday that the 2 threads drew together and broke. He learned of it of the doctor's suit, and of the town's expectation, and of how near the thing was said to stand by the commonest chance. From the loose tongue of a fellow at the inn ordinary who knew him for no more than a gentleman lodging in the town, and who retailed to him, as a piece of pleasant local news over the mutton, that Dr. Renton was to have the lady at the Grey House at last, and a very proper match. And the whole country glad of it. I was by him when he heard it. I saw the blood go out of his face and then come back into it dark. I saw his hand close upon the table's edge until the knuckles whitened, and I saw, worst of all, that the news did not humble him, but roused the old blind pride to a kind of fury, so that where a wiser grief would have sent him running to a door bareheaded to plead for his life, his pride sent him there armoured to command, for he could not bear it. That she should have overlooked him who had come so far, and put aside so much, and meant to lay a fortune at her feet, and taken, instead, a country physician of 50, with a small library and a smaller name, it was not to be borne. It affronted, all at once, his love and his consequence together, and the two, so long as he could not tell them apart, made between them a heat that burned up in a moment all the slow-schooled patience of the spring. He went to her that afternoon. He would not be denied. He sent up no civil note this time and waited for no correct hour, but went straight to the Grey House under the west front and was admitted, and I with him as far as the passage, for he bade me attend him, and I durst not leave him in that state. And I stood by the half-open door of her small parlour and heard the whole of that last dreadful interview, and have never in the years between been able to forget one word of it. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of her quiet room with his hat in his hand, and he told her not asked her, told her that he had heard what was reported in the town, and that he had come to prevent her from committing an irreparable folly. He begged her to consider what she did. He set it before her, in the plain hard magistrate's language that was his ruin, as a question of advantage and of sense, that she was proposing to bury herself, her person and her parts and her whole future, in an obscure alliance beneath her deserts. When it was in her power he came to it heavily, as a man plays his highest card when it was in her power to be Duchess of Charnwood. He had come, he said, to renew, formally and finally, offer of his hand, and he had come besides prepared to settle upon her, whatever her answer, a provision that should make her independent for her life. And he could not, in honour or in common humanity, stand by and see a woman of her understanding throw away, out of some lingering resentment of an old and unmeant word, the greatest establishment the kingdom had to give. There was a silence in the little room, and when Jane Verrall spoke, it was in that even and unfaltering voice I had learned to know for the strongest thing in her, and there was no anger in it, only a great and settled weariness, which was far worse than anger, and which I hear yet. She said that she perceived his grace had understood nothing. She said it without heat and without unkindness, as one states a plainf of the weather, and then she told him, quietly, the whole of it, and closed the door upon him for good in the telling. She said that he had named the very thing wherein he failed, when he spoke of resentment of an old word, that he supposed her, still after everything, to be a woman standing upon an injured vanity, waiting to be soothed and outbid and won back by larger offer. and that he could not conceive it was not in him to conceive that she was not haggling with him at all, but declining him, that she wanted neither his hand nor his fortune nor his consequence, not because they were too little for her pride, but because they were the wrong things, offered by a man who to this hour did not know what the right thing was. She had been, she reminded him, gone by morning once, out of his very house, and he had not perceived that she was worth the crossing of a room to keep, until she was clean out of his reach. And she had watched him now, this whole summer, come after her not because he had last seen her, but because the loss of her had galled his consequence, and the seeing of her taken by another had galled it further, and she had asked herself, plainly, whether she would set her whole self, her one life, a second time into the keeping of a man who found her only in the losing of it, and who even now, standing in her own parlour with his heart, she did not doubt, breaking behind his fine cold face, could find no better speech to make her than an inventory of what she stood to gain. She would not, she said. She had made a life that saw her. She meant to keep it, and whether she gave it into the good doctor's hands or held it in her own, she would give it to no man who could stand where his grace now stood and speak to her of establishments. She thanked him for the honour which she knew to be truly meant. She was sorry, more sorry than he would believe, for the pain she rid in him and could not mend, since he would not let her come at it, and she wished him, with her whole heart, a better fortune than she could give him. And she rose, and opened the door herself. I stepped back into the shadow of the passage and stood beside it, and waited for him to go. And he went. That is the thing I have never been able to forgive him, and have never ceased to pity him for, and shall carry to my grave, that even then, even in that last hollow moment with the door open at her hand and the whole ruin of his life lay before him, the plain and thunderstruck truth still damned and choking in him that he had been wrong, that he saw her now, that he loved her herself, past all consequence, and asked for nothing under heaven but to be let humbly to love her. Even then he could not get it past his teeth. The pride stood in the gate of his mouth, and would not let the poor true word by. He bowed to her, stiffly, with a face like grey stone. He said, in a voice from which everything living had been pressed out, that he would trouble her no further, and that he perceived he had been mistaken in his errand, and he walked out past me into the passage and out of the grey house into the Sunday light, and did not once look back. We left Wells upon the Monday morning. There was no more talk of settlements. The man from Bath was sent back with his deeds undrawn, and my master gave the order for the north in a voice so dead that I did not dare answer it with anything but a bow. As the chaise drew up out of the town, I looked back, once at the great west front standing gold in the early sun over the huddle of the grey roofs, and thought of the good doctor waiting at his fireside for the answer I made no doubt he would now receive, and of the woman under the shadow of the cathedral who had at last, and past all mending, closed her door, and I looked at the man beside me, sitting bolt upright with his hat down and his face to the window, and not a word in him, having found the one creature in the world he wanted and lost her twice over by the one same fault. And I confess that I saw, in that grey Monday hour, no hope for either of them anywhere upon the earth. We were 2 days upon the northern road, and my master did not speak upon the first of them. He sat with his face to the window and the country going by unseen, and ate nothing, and slept, I think, not at all. And I let him alone, judging that there is a grief the kindest thing one can do for it is to give it room. But upon the second day, climbing through a bare high country of walls and wind, he spoke, and what he said was the first crack of light I had seen in the whole black wall of that summer, though I did not at the first know it for such. He said, without turning from the glass, in a voice worn quite smooth of its old command, that he had been thinking upon a thing I had once said to him, that a lady nice in her independence might feel a great provision as a weight and not a freedom, and that he had answered I did not understand these matters. He was silent a mile. Then he said that it was he who had not understood them, that he had not understood any matter of the least importance in the whole of his life, and that a man may be 35, and a duke and master of 10,000 acres, and be at the bottom of him a fool so entire that a woman of no fortune in a small town under a cathedral could see clean through him at a single sitting and tell him in words he would carry to his grave exactly what he was. I ventured nothing. I had learned that summer that when the true thing begins at last to move in a proud man, it must not be helped, or it takes fright and hides again, and I let him come to it in his own way. He said that she had told him he found her worth only in the losing of it, and that he had ridden from her door affronted by the words as by an injustice, and had discovered these 2 days that they were no injustice, but a plain report of the fact, and the truest thing ever said to him. He had had her under his own roof a whole season, he said, and looked past her every day as a man looks past the furniture. He had called her convenient and unremarkable in the hearing of his servants, and thought no more of it than of remarking that a room was of a good proportion, and it had taken the emptying of his house and the sight of a better man about to be made happy by her to teach him the one thing a child might have told him for the asking, that she was the most remarkable creature he had ever come near, and that he had walked past her for the plainest of reasons, which was that he had never once troubled to look. He turned from the window then, and his face was not the grey stone I had grown used to. It was a man's face, undefended and older, and there was water standing in his eyes that he made no motion to hide, which in all my years of him he had never done before. He said very low that he loved her, that he had loved her. He now believed from the 3rd or 4th day after we found her again at Wells, and had not known the name of the thing, because he had never felt it before, that he had offered a consequence because it was the only coin he possessed, and had thought that a large enough heap of it must at last stand in the place of the thing he did not know how to give. And he said, and here his voice broke fairly, and he let it, that he had stood in her parlour with the true word in his very mouth twice over, and had let his pride swallow it down rather than be seen to beg, and that he had got as far now, too late and 140 miles too far to the north, as to understand that the word he had been too proud to say was the only word worth the saying, and that a man who would not say it deserved precisely the empty house and the cold bed he was riding toward. We had by then come to a small grey posting town upon the very lip of the moor, where the road forks, the one way running north for Charnwood and the other bending back by the west toward the Vale of Wells, and the horses being spent, we had put up to change, and my master had said all this last of it standing in the mean parlour they gave us, with his back to a smoking fire. And when he had said it, he stood a long moment looking at nothing, and then he asked me in a strange humble voice I had never heard from him what he ought to do. He, who had never in his life asked any living man that question, asked it of his secretary, as simply as a boy asks his tutor. I had my answer ready, for I had carried it in my breast since the Sunday, and I gave it him as steadily as I could for the beating of my own heart. I said that there was one thing left that he had never yet done, and it was the only thing that had ever been wanted of him, that he had never once gone to her with nothing in his hands. He had gone with his rank and the mending of a scandal and a fortune and his consequence. He had never gone with only himself and the truth and no defence, and asked for nothing. I said I did not know whether it was too late that she might by this hour be promised past recall to a man who deserved her, and if she were, he must bear it in silence and be glad for her, for that too would be a kind of loving her at last. But I said that if he did not go back and lay the whole naked truth of himself before her, no claim upon under heaven, then he would spend the remainder of his life knowing that the one time it was in his power to say the saving word he had chosen instead to save his dignity, and that a man might live with a refusal, but I did not think even he could live with that. He looked at me for the length of a breath, then he called down into the yard, in a voice with the life come back into it, to turn the horses and put them to for the west. And he was out and down the stair before I had my hat, and within the quarter hour we were rocking down the western fork with the whole long road to Wells to be undone before dark. He did not sit bolt upright now with his hat down. He sat forward upon the very edge of the seat, as though he would push the carriage on by the leaning of his own body. And once he said, half to himself, that he asked nothing of Providence but to be let to say the thing once before another man's ring was on her hand. I never prayed harder over a thing so far of my mending than I prayed, that long grey afternoon, that we should be in time. We came down into Wells in the last of the light, the great west front standing rose and gold above, the dusk exactly as I had seen it the morning we fled. And he would not so much as go to the inn to put off the dust of the road, but bade the man drive straight to the grey house under the cathedral, and was out and rapping at the door before the wheels had fairly stopped. I followed him to the step and no further, and saw him standing there bareheaded in the doorway, his hat crushed in both hands like any suppliant off the road. This man before whom half a county uncovered, and I confess my eyes stung to see it, for I knew that the proud fool I had served was gone and a truer man stood in his place. They admitted him, the door closed, and I walked up and down under the darkening front, among the jackdaws going home to the towers for the better part of an hour, and knew nothing. What passed within I had afterward, in part from him and in fuller part, long after, from her own lips, and I set it down as near as I am able. She received him alone in the small parlour where she had closed the door upon him the Sunday before, and she did not sit nor ask him to. She stood by her own fire with her hands folded and her level look upon him, giving him nothing, waiting to see what he had come so far to say. And he did not begin, as he had always begun, with what he had to offer. He stood in the middle of her quiet room and laid his hat down and said she told me the words, and I believe I have them true, that he had come to take back 2 words he had once let fall in his own house, and that he knew he could not take them back, for a word once said cannot be unsaid, but that he must try, or die of the leaving of it untried. He said that he had called her convenient and unremarkable, and that they were the 2 most false words ever spoken upon the earth, and the great error of his whole life, and that he had come the length of the kingdom to tell her that she was not unremarkable, but the single most remarkable person he had ever known or ever should, that he had had her by him a whole spring and been too blind to see it, and had only learned to see when the loss of her taught him, and that he had loved her from the hour he began to look, and would love her to the last hour he drew breath, whatever she now said to him. And then, and this she told me, was the thing that undid all her defences, not the words of love, which she had half looked for, but what came after. He said that he had not come to offer her a convenient match, nor a duchess's establishment, nor consequence, nor a fortune, nor any single thing a duke had in his gift, that he had left all of that in the north where it belonged, and brought her nothing at all but himself, standing before her with no claim and no defence and nothing owed, an equal asking an equal, that he wanted her, and not one fraction of her, and nothing else in the world beside, and that he would not press her nor come again if she sent him away, but would abide in whatever she chose, and be grateful to the end of his days only to have been let to say it once to her face. And having said it, he was silent, and he did not go down upon his knee, which she said she was glad of, for there were no gestures left in him. He only stood, his hands open at his sides and his heart bare in his face, and wait upon her word as a man waits upon a verdict. She did not give it him quickly. She was not a woman to be swept off her feet by a fine speech, though it were the truest ever made, and she had been undervalued too long to fling her whole self a second time upon the strength of an hour's feeling. She looked at him a great while, searching his face for the old thing, the pride, the man who had come before to command and bestow, and she did not find it. She asked him quietly, and to the bone, whether he knew that she was no longer the poor relation he had overlooked, that she had her own house now, and her own fortune, small but wholly hers, and her own place among people who valued her, and needed nothing from him or from any man, whether he understood that if she took him it would not be because she wanted a roof, or a name, or rescue, but only because she chose him freely, from her own strength, and could as well have done without him. And he said, yes, that it was the whole ground of his hope and the whole measure of his dread. For a woman who needed nothing and yet chose him would be giving him the one gift he had never been offered in his life, which was to be wanted for himself alone, and that if she could not give it, he would rather have her refusal, freely made from her strength, than any yielding made from need. It was that, she told me, that he had understood at last the very thing he had been most blind to, her independence, and had honoured it, and staked everything upon it instead of trying to buy his way past it, which convinced her, when all the rest might not have, that the man before her was truly changed, and truly saw her, and loved the actual woman she was, and not the convenient one he had once had of her. And so she weighed him clear-eyed upon her own hearth, with her own fortune at her back, and finding him, past all further doubt, a true man who saw her whole, she chose him. She did not fall into his arms. It was not that kind of choosing. She put out her hand to him and said, gravely, that she believed him, and would be his wife, and that he had been a very long time about the saying of a very short thing, but that she found, now it was said, it had been worth the waiting for. And he took her hand in both of his and bowed his head over it, and could not for a while say anything at all, and that, she told me with the ghost of her dry smile, was the first eloquent thing she had ever known him do. There remained the good doctor, and I will not pass him by, for he was the best man in the whole of this history save one. Jane had never deceived him, that must be understood, for it was the marrow of her. She had asked him for her few days and no more, promised him nothing, and held her hand honestly open the whole while. Upon the very next morning, before ever the town had the news, she went herself to Dr. Renton, on foot and alone, and told him plainly what had passed and what she had chosen, and did not spare herself in the telling. He heard her out, and being the man he was, he did not reproach her, nor let her see more of what it cost him than a good man cannot help. He said only that he had known from the evening he first saw the Duke's grey face across her fire how it might go, and had made himself ready. That he could not be sorry she was to be so happy, though he had hoped to be the maker of that happiness himself, and that if ever she or hers had need of a friend or a physician in the Vale, his door was hers for the asking, and no debt. And he took her hand, and wished her joy, and let her go. And I have always held that there was more true nobility in that grey parlour that morning than all the coronets of the kingdom. He did not wither. He was too large a man for that. He is living yet, esteemed of the whole country. And when the Duchess's first son was ill of a fever in his 3rd year, it was Dr. Renton of Wells, who was sent for over all the grander men of Bath, and who sat up the 2 nights and brought the child through. And the friendship between that house and that plain good man is one of the things I am gladdest of in the whole story. They were married in the autumn, in the great church at Wells, under the very west front that had stood gold above our flight and gold above our return. And I stood up in it and saw the poor relation who had been gone by morning out of a duke's house come up the aisle of the cathedral to be made Duchess of Charnwood, not rescued, not repaired, not conveniently disposed of, but chosen and cherished, and seen at last for the whole of what she was, and mistress still, in the giving of herself. She was not a beauty, and the county, which had looked for a duke to bring home some famous face, was puzzled at the first by the quiet, self-possessed woman he set at the head of his table, but the county learned her, as at the very last her husband had the wit and humility to learn her, and I do not think there was a great house in England where the master so plainly went in awe and delight of the mistress, or where a marriage begun so ill grew into a thing so good, and that is the whole of it. I have set it all down, the folly and the flight and the long blind chase and the 2 returns, because I was there for the most of it, and because there is in it a plain lesson. My master, being a great man, once let fall 2 careless words about a woman he had not troubled to look at. She was convenient and unremarkable, and those 2 words emptied his great house of the one thing in it worth the keeping, and cost him a summer of the sharpest misery I ever watched a man endure. And the whole of his pride laid down in a doorway under the dusk, and all of it went to the buying of a single piece of knowledge that the poorest man in Wells had for nothing, that the convenient, unremarkable woman was the most remarkable thing that ever came into his life. He paid a great price for it, but he had, in the end, the humility to say it plainly to her face when the saying might have been his ruin, and the great good fortune to be believed. And if you had seen him, as I have seen him many an evening since, sitting quiet by his own fire with that quiet woman across the hearth, saying little, for they were neither of them great talkers, but watching her over his book with the look of a man who cannot yet credit his luck, why, you would agree with me, I think, that of all the matches the Duke ever called in his life, the only one worth the calling was the one he was very nearly too blind and too proud to make.